Hey there, everyone. This is Ari Whitten back with the Energy Blueprint podcast. And with me today is Guillermo Ruiz, who I had the pleasure of meeting on a recent backpacking trip in the Grand Canyon, where we were with Dr. Alan Christensen. And he's a friend of Dr. Alan Christensen, as am I. And we kind of were introduced there and hit it off and had some awesome discussions. And Guillermo is doing some really fascinating research in the area of different botanical extracts and specifically in relationship to infections. He's currently a naturopathic medical student, but he's not really just kind of any typical naturopathic student. He's really involved, deeply involved with a lot of cutting edge research in this field. And so he knows a ton. He's already an expert, and I'm happy to share his wisdom with you today. So welcome, Guillermo.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, man. How are you doing?
Oh, it's 72 degrees in Arizona, so it's just perfect.
Nice. Cool. So tell me, so obviously we're talking about fatigue, we're talking about energy enhancement, and chronic infections is something that we hear a lot about. There's research implicating it as a trigger for chronic fatigue syndrome, and there's a lot of discussion around this idea of chronic infections or hidden infections in relationship to fatigue. So can you talk just a little about what that connection is all about?
Well, this chronic infections, these pathogens, the intracellular pathogens are just so pesky because, we talk a lot about evolutionary medicine, and we always talk about like the things that we have evolved to live in this environment. For example, we have amylase, we can eat carbohydrates, but seldomly do we turn around that microscope and start talking about the evolutionary things that these infections do to you. And I want to start this with a little story about American people that were going to Africa to help kids get better. They were missionaries, and they went to Africa, and they were testing for iron, and they found that a lot of kids had low levels of iron. So they started supplementing with iron. And malaria actually does something really funny. It goes intracellularly and it starts affecting your body, adapts itself to sequester iron from your blood. So it takes iron and hides it because bacteria, viruses, they use this iron in order to reproduce. So the body has evolved mechanisms to help fight infections, just like fever, but differently, so this trying to get away, the precursors for this bacteria and viruses to reproduce. So then what happened with this missionary started injecting iron? The kids started dying.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it ramped up those infections, and these kids began to, get worse, and eventually the infection proliferated and then these kids, died. So if you go on PubMed and you start looking at, the recommendations for missionaries or people trying to set up a free clinic, or you can only supplement people with deficiencies in iron if you have a solid anti-malaria protocol or a solid anti-malaria clinic in those regions.
Wow,
Because
interesting.
So
it sounds to me like anemia could almost be a response to an infection or connected to that infection in some way?
It actually has a medical name. It's called anemia of chronic disease.
Wow.
Yeah. So, what I'm getting to is that as practitioners, we like to do tests. We like to see a number. And then if we have that number, then we can do things to change that number. But we can get into a lot of trouble when we're bypassing evolutionary mechanisms in order just to see a number change. And that's where we need to be a little bit more careful. And actually, it sounds like a meme now. Everyone is saying, oh, you got to remove obstacles to cure. You got to remove obstacles to health. You hear it from any practitioner, that's the goal. But having low levels of iron in your blood, might not mean that you just have an iron deficiency. It could mean that you have a chronic infection and your body is responding adequately to that infection.
Very interesting. Okay, so I have so many questions, but the first one is this something unique to malaria, or does this apply to a lot of different potential infectious microorganisms?
So this is a problem with things that grow with the use of iron, like cancer. So you can get anemia of chronic disease from cancerous processes. You can get anemia of chronic disease from different viruses, even like those intracellular parasitic, like Lyme disease and anything that is intracellular like that will cause you to have anemia of chronic disease.
Wow. So if somebody has anemia, I know a common recommendation would be to supplement with iron. It seems like that might be a tricky idea. And so anemia is kind of this weird scenario where anemia is this thing that's often connected to fatigue, but the typical sort of thinking around it would just be, supplement with iron.
It could be, especially like, for example, if you are female, and you have heavy periods, if you have a lot of intestinal damage where you might have, you might be bleeding from an ulcer. Maybe that could be the cause of the anemia. So maybe getting a stool sample and checking for occult blood. If you are female with like heavy periods and maybe you have PCOS, or maybe you have an underlying condition. But it always goes back to, okay, what is the reason for the anemia? But if you're a 30-year-old male who is not bleeding because they don't, we don't do leeches, or we don't have ceremonial cuts, or we're not hiking and losing a little bit of blood here and there because you scrape yourself, and you have low iron, that's tricky. Now, will you feel better? Okay, so for your listeners, anemia, if you want to break it down to the simplest way, terms, anemia is the inability for your blood to carry oxygen to tissues because you're using the iron as a cofactor for hemoglobin. So having anemia is any of the reasons why your blood cannot carry oxygen. For example, you can be bleeding out and you don't have the volume. You can have anemia of chronic disease where your body is hiding that iron. So diagnosing someone with anemia just because their CBC, their complete blood panel, says that they are low in iron, it's very lazy. And if you give them iron, they might feel better for the short term. But if you don't correct that ulcer, if you don't correct that PCOS, if you don't correct the chronic infection, you're going to be supplementing for a very long time. And if you have anemia of chronic disease, where your body is doing what the body has evolved to do, which is sequester iron, you might be feeding the fire.
So it sounds like if somebody has fatigue and they have been diagnosed with anemia, it sounds to me like a differential diagnosis is really, really critical at that point. So you don't just go and start supplementing with iron when you in fact have a chronic infection and your body's sequestering that iron for a reason to help you fend off this microorganism that's infected you. And people should be very wary of just rushing to start supplementing with iron if they have anemia.
Yeah, and you see it. You see it more. You will see more anemia, in female patients, it's more common, but a red flag would be to have a healthy looking 30-year-old male that maybe has been hiking in the Northeast. And now they start getting like this pain in their muscles all over their body, and now they're getting fatigue. Now, you wouldn't be too crazy if you were thinking Lyme disease if they have anemia.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me what kinds of other infections might be common triggers for fatigue.
Okay, well, so back on the Borrelia or Lyme disease wagon, not only does your body do this sequestering of iron, this organism now that's turning the evolutionary mechanisms on the microorganism. This intracellular parasites or this intracellular organisms actually they go into the nucleus of the cell, and they change the coding, and then your cell stops expressing VDR, vitamin D receptor. Okay, so once you stop creating that VDR, now your cells is not accepting the vitamin D. And
why do they do that?
Because vitamin D activates the immune system.
Aha.
So it's trying to protect itself from the immune system.
Sneaky little bastards, huh?
It's so fascinating. It's so fascinating because, when I started listening to this evolutionary health stuff and started really getting into outside of the box with health, vitamin D was like the golden child. Everyone should benefit from, people would say people should benefit from supplementing 5,000 IUs of vitamin D every day.
Yeah, of course.
But the more we learn, maybe that's not the correct answer. And one of the biggest problems is that if you have fatigue and then you go in there and you again draw some labs and then you see low levels of vitamin D and you supplement with vitamin D, well, the VDR receptor is no longer active on those cells. So now you're not utilizing the vitamin D that's going through your system. So that lab is going to improve. And then, your doctor is going to be, okay, I fixed it. But you haven't fixed anything because that is not active.
Gotcha. So vitamin D supplementation, I mean, what you're just saying is that it won't work, or would it actually be harmful? Is there a risk of it actually being counterproductive?
So it's not going to activate the immune system. Okay, so your body is going to want to do something with that vitamin D. So worst case scenario, maybe you have a deficiency of vitamin K. Vitamin K can only be acquired from a very specific food sources. For example, you can get vitamin K from natto, which is fermented, slimy soybeans. Okay, or you can get vitamin K from dairy of animals that have been pastured on green pastures. So, like for example, here in Arizona, I can go to my local store and get some grass-fed dairy, but they feed those cows mostly hay, which is grass that has been dried. That is not a good source of vitamin K. So what ends up happening if you don't have the vitamin K, which the vitamin K tells where to calcify, and you have vitamin D, which says calcify, you're not having the format to say, you need to put the calcium into the bone. And if you have excess vitamin D, you might start calcifying your vessels, which is how you end up getting heart disease.
Yeah, atherosclerosis, or you get kidney stones, or
yeah. And so again, so what do we do about this? Well, if you have any person that has increased levels of inflammation is going to probably have lower levels of vitamin D than necessary. Okay, so again, if you have a vitamin D deficiency, there is a reason why you have that vitamin D deficiency. In the case of inflammation, you're overusing your vitamin D to activate immune system, to do all this, all these different things. So just supplementing with vitamin D might not be the way of modulating that inflammation.
Okay.
And then most importantly, that the way we acquire vitamin D is through the sun. You walking outside for around 10 to 15 minutes in full spectrum sunlight. That gets that sunlight hits your skin, and then there's around 16 or 18 different things that happen. And out of those things, we don't even know what half of those things do. We haven't spent the time to see what the repercussion of the conversion of sunlight into vitamin D, what happens. When you supplement vitamin D, you're basically skipping all that cascade of the reactions, and we don't know what the repercussions of not having that cascade do to you.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, there's so many different things that happen during sun exposure. And to me, it's always absurd when I hear people, make recommendations to stay out of the sun. So many people are sun phobic, and then give recommendations to supplement with vitamin D, as a pill. And they equate the two as being the same. And like you said, there's so many things that happen with sun exposure. I mean, we're being exposed to infrared light. We're being exposed to lots of different kinds of UV light, red and near infrared light, which have all these kinds of different physiological effects. And then I've even heard people, I should also mention Stephanie Seneff has theorized that cholesterol sulfate, which is also synthesized from the sun, is like just as important or maybe even more important than vitamin D. And then, we also have, I've even heard people talk about the ultraviolet light kind of irradiating the blood in the capillaries of the skin, and that may be potentially having some antimicrobial effects, and all kinds of different mechanisms going on there. And it's kind of absurd to say, hey, just pop this vitamin D pill, and that's the equivalent of being out in the sun regularly.
And then on the flip side, there's been in the past couple of years, this is pretty recent, 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of talk about MTHFR. Okay. And that being, having a mutation in your glutathione pathways, where you are maybe not methylating enough in order to detoxify. Mm-hmm. That's been a hot topic. But it's such a new frontier. Mm-hmm. And usually, we get really excited about things, new discoveries, or, and we just jump to fit in, and then we just, go all out on that type of stuff. The problem is that there are people that over-methylate. So you have under-methylators, and then you have over-methylators. Mm-hmm. And when we supplement, you can go to any health food source and ask them, and ask the guy standing there by the supplements, what's the best form of vitamin D? They'll tell you D3, cholecalciferol. They'll do not take the cyanoform, that's bad. That doesn't work. Or of the B12 vitamin, because you got to get the methylated form, because those methyl factors are going to help you. The problem is that with over methylators, you start accumulating those methyl factors, and then you end up having the same symptoms as someone that under methylates. So mental fog, you have, the mental fatigue, you have this chronic fatigue syndrome picture presents if you are an over methylator that is just getting a bunch of vitamin Bs that are methylated, or vitamin B12, that has that methyl group. as if you were an undermethylator that was not getting enough vitamin B's and B12s. So this whole supplementation thing, it's really sexy. It's really, it's an actionable thing for a lot of people, but we need to be careful that we are only using this supplementation, the methylated B vitamins, only if you've discovered it, if you have a practitioner with you that has analyzed your genome, or whatever they want to do, and they are like, okay, this is the reason why you need it.
Yeah, actually, on that note, I've recently did a 23andMe genetic analysis and ran it through a couple of these aftermarket gene analyzers. There's one particular woman who specializes in nutrigenomics, and her name's Amy Yasko. And I ran it through her free gene analyzer, and I swear I was given a recommendation to go on I want to say 75 different supplements that are supposed to help me with methylation. And I'm not even trying to exaggerate there. I honestly think it might have been in the neighborhood of 75 different things that were being recommended to me. And then I ran it through another gene analysis tool that told me that I methylate extremely well. Like, I ranked as an A+ in terms of methylation. So on the one hand, I'm getting this one gene that's saying, hey, you're great at methylation. And then the other one saying, hey, you're terrible. You need 75 different supplements so that you can methylate properly. And that's, to me, that's scary, because what if I go and spend whatever, $1,000 or $2,000 to get all these supplements, and then they actually end up making me worse, if anything?
Yeah. So that's such a big concern, because, when in this functional medicine world, you have the people that have done the research, and they're solid, and they have the clinical experience, and they have had thousands of patients that they get them better, but then they go in on a podcast, or they write a blog on methylated vitamin D, methylated vitamin B12, and how it's it's better than taking the cyanocobalamin form of the vitamin. The problem is that the people that are on the outside looking in, okay, maybe the MDs that are not totally convinced about this functional medicine, they're still in the old world, and they have to see patients for 5 minutes. They read this blog, and now they're recommending vitamin B12, methylated vitamin, to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then, or even worse, a person at your local food market is now, I just read this on Dr. Google, and he says that vitamin B12 is the greatest thing. And now you're taking everyone's taking vitamin B12, and either two things happen. They don't feel better, or worse, they end up having more symptoms of methylation problems. So this supplementation route of things is just such a rabbit hole.
Yeah,
now,
for sure. Yeah, I agree.
Now,
I saw just the other day, someone posted an article. Someone was asking me what I thought of this article. It was on lithium. It was 25 benefits of lithium. And I said, and she was asking me what I think of the idea of supplementing. And I said, be cautious, because this article is making it sound like this miracle substance where the more you take of it, the better.
Yeah.
And, be aware that, for example, lithium is actually used to treat hyperthyroidism, to suppress thyroid function. And, getting too much of this stuff is also bad for you. So, I think all of this is really, to me, it's an argument in favor of eating a nutrient-dense whole food diet and not getting too carried away with supplementation of isolated nutrients.
And that's where I was taking this. That's the point that I wanted to make. I don't want to sound doom and gloom. I don't want to. I don't want you to go into your cabinet and just throw away all your supplements right now. But cover your bases, start with a nutritionally dense, varied diet. And once you have that nutritionally dense diet, I assure you 90% of the population will get better. It's that 10% that might need some supplementation. And the supplementation is going to be so surgical and so pointed, if your practitioner is thinking about your health from an evolutionary perspective. For example, I don't know if this is a cool question for you, but how many supplements do you take?
That's a good question. I would say that I rotate through a number of them. I take probably, I don't know, 6 to 10 different things at any given time. But very few isolated vitamins and minerals.
Which, so it's
so
like,
I take a lot of like phytochemicals, for example.
It's like the difference between taking, like, for example, purified fish oil. Okay. So purified, it's a polyunsaturated fatty acid that once it gets to your stomach, some of it is going to be converted into reactive oxygen species, which is the opposite of the reason why we take fish oil.
Right.
Okay. Versus taking something like cod liver oil, which is closer to a food that doesn't have as high levels of DHA and EPA, but it does have things that protect the DHA and EPA to actually making it into the places where you go.
Right.
Curcumin versus turmeric. Over and over again, we're trying to find ways of making curcumin more absorbable. If you were living in a place that uses turmeric on a daily basis, and they did an autopsy on your brain would be yellow. And that's not with, this fancy form of curcumin, lipolyzed, or, it doesn't matter. It's because the constant exposure to it, to a food source of curcumin, actually makes it to where you want it. So you start with a nutritionally dense diet, and there's things that you're going to have to supplement. For example, magnesium. I take magnesium because it's so hard to get magnesium from the soil. Yeah. The soil, we've destroyed our soils with monocrops, and so I do take a magnesium supplement, and that's about the only supplement that I take on a regular basis. I do rotate with different, like I'm going to try cordyceps, which is a mushroom coming up, and I want to see, I'm going to try to take some measures and see what happens when I take this cordyceps. Yeah,
there's been some good studies that have come out on cordyceps, both militaris and sinus, in the last year or two. Cool. Improving endurance and exercise performance and things like that. So that's a good one.
Yeah, so it's going to be really exciting to do that. But other than that, if you or your listeners have this fatigue, if they have this, if they think they have a nutritional deficiency somewhere, investigate why.
Okay, so on that note, real quick, and then I want to get deeper back into infection. So what do you recommend as far as investigating why? Like, what is the process that you think someone should undertake to investigate?
Well, the first step could be, if you have, let's say you have a B12 deficiency and you don't happen to eat animal products, maybe that's a reason. Yeah. A couple of superfoods that have some B12. They might have the cyanocobalamin type of B12, and people consume them and they say, I'm getting my B12 from the cyanocobalamin. The problem with that is that attaches to the receptor of vitamin B12, and it actually blocks it and prevents it from working.
So just want to be clear, the foods you're talking about are what, like algae, like spirulina, chlorella, things like that?
Specifically spirulina, Okay. So you have the B12 molecule circulating, so they take your blood and it looks like you're fine, but it actually is not working.
Right.
Now, I don't want, this is, I'm not trying to convince anyone to start eating meat, you do you. But if you go online, and there's so many different tracking websites, and you have fatigue, and you look at you think you're eating clean, or you're eating clean, go ahead and input into one of these websites and look at the micronutrient profile.
Mm.
Maybe you are just missing copper. Maybe that's one of the hard ones to get. Maybe you're not taking enough like lithium. And if it's not coming from your diet, and you're not hitting that RDA, the first step would be, what are the foods that have this type of nutrient? And then go at it. Try to include them in your food, and then check back in a couple of weeks or in a month and see if you still have those nutritional deficiencies.
Gotcha.
The big red flags are going to be when you have aches and pains, when you have this mental fatigue, when you don't have the precursors to make serotonin and dopamine, and then do not jump directly into the supplementation. There is a reason why you need, maybe your body is utilizing this because of a disease process. Maybe you have an intracellular organism that it's preventing you from absorbing it. Maybe your blood glucose is through the roof, and your body is trying to figure out what to do with this inflammation, and it's utilizing your vitamin D faster than it should be. And that's when you have to zoom in and make sure that if you have an underlying infection, you take steps to correct that.
Yeah. And so on that note, that's a perfect lead in, since we want to get back into more of infections. Tell me about what are the steps you'd recommend. Let's say someone has fatigue and they suspect that it might be related to some kind of infection. What are the steps that you'd recommend? And I guess, first of all, maybe we should get into diagnosis a bit, because I've heard mixed opinions on this subject. Some physicians I've spoken to have said, we can diagnose active infections versus previous ones. And other physicians I've spoken to have said that the diagnostic tools for looking at antibodies to viruses, for example, are not very good at detecting whether something is a current infection versus a past infection. So what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, first of all, okay, I'm not a doctor. Yeah, I'll be a doctor in.
You'll be a doctor in 12 weeks.
12 weeks, I will be a doctor. I still have to pass my boards, but 12 weeks, I'll finish my program.
So he's being modest, everyone. He's like top of his class. He's acing all of his classes, so there's no worries about him passing his boards.
The first thing on my blog, I have a huge blog post. It's three sections long on how to select a practitioner. Because when I'm from Florida, and when I moved to Arizona, the first thing that people would ask me is like, when are you going to be done? And it was 4 years away. And then I remember when I was back in Orlando, I went to my doctor and I wanted to know what my testosterone level was. It's my body. I want to know how much testosterone I have circulating. The doctor fired me on the spot. He said, you are not, I'm not what you need. I don't want to run these labs because I think you're going to go to the streets and get testosterone. So I'm just terminating our relationship. You need to go find another doctor.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you have chronic fatigue, if you felt better before, and for some reason you think that you are no longer feeling optimal, you are not crazy. You need to follow. You are your only advocate. Go find a doctor that is willing to work with you.
Mm.
And that's whether you do paleo, vegan, if you want to become a photosynthesis organism, go find a doctor that agrees with you, and that it's going to see things, and it's going to help you. It's a team effort. You have to take care of yourself, and that doctor might be the quarterback that is going to pass the ball to the right people, but they're not going to be a dictator that says you are way more than what I need. I just want to prescribe your statin and go away. Find a doctor that is willing to work with you. That's the number one thing. And then secondly, let's investigate what's going on. Some things are going to be very easy to tease out. For example, if you are from Arizona and you feel crappy and you have a cough that it doesn't go away, there is an infection called coccidioidomycosis here in the Southwest. That it's an organism. It's the type of yeast that goes into your lung and creates lesions. A lot, very similar to what tuberculosis does, and that could be a reason. That could be an endemic thing that's happening in your region. If you're in the Northeast, be aware of Lyme disease. Seriously consider if you like to hike and you are healthy and you want to go and then all of a sudden you start getting aches and pains, be aware of that. And then thirdly is that sometimes we try to do things in the natural way, but in some cases, an antibiotic, might be the best way to get rid of that. For example, with Lyme disease, if you catch it early, a course of doxycycline or minocycline, might nip in the bud. And if you try to treat it naturally, you might miss that window where that infection might go deeper, intracellular, going into the dormant state, and then it's so much harder to get rid of it. Yeah. But most importantly, find an advocate. And it could be a doctor, that is going to help you investigate and find. But maybe it's an acupuncturist. Maybe it's, maybe you have a very smart personal trainer that you trust. Maybe you have someone that, and they might not be your practitioner, but they might help you find the right practitioner and find the right course of action. I like to say that, that health, it doesn't start at the hospital. Health doesn't start at the doctor's office. Health starts with food in your kitchen. And anyone can be a healer. You don't have to have an MD or DO or DC or ND behind your name to be a healer. In fact, if you want to heal someone, there are many more ways to do it than just prescribing or giving supplementation.
Okay. So let's say someone has chronic fatigue. Someone suspects there might be an infectious trigger involved in why that happened. And they go get testing from a doctor, and nothing significant really shows up on the tests, and which seems to be a fairly common occurrence. I've seen a lot of people. I mean, first of all, the testing for infections is kind of not a super common thing, and it seems like the patient kind of almost has to talk the doctor into testing for infections in the first place, and then, like I mentioned before, it seems like there's controversy around whether these tests can even detect active versus past infections in many cases, especially when it comes to viruses. So what do you recommend for a person in that scenario? Are there natural methods that we can look at? Assuming they're eating a healthy diet, what are some strategies that you might recommend to somebody who wants to help their body overcome an infection of some kind?
There's a lot of things you can do to optimize your immune system. Okay. And again, not a doctor, but there is a window of opportunity to maximize the effects of therapies. For example, fasting. Fasting upregulates your immune system. You shunt some of the energy that you would use to digest food, and you actually activate different mechanisms within your immune system that could help you get over an infection faster.
Mm.
There's a lot of really cool research coming out on sauna and on cold therapies to stimulate perfusion, and you stimulate perfusion, and then you're going to stimulate the cleaning and clearing of bad stuff within your blood.
Mm-hmm.
Prevention would be very important, but no one cares about prevention, because once it happens. So then you can start looking into different botanicals or things to optimize the response of your of the infection.
And now we're in your area of expertise. Yeah. This is where all your research is, and you waited this long to talk to us about it.
Well, so that's the problem, because like you said, you have to know what the infection is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like really short story. It's really difficult to get funding for botanical research because you can't patent the plant. So in order to try to like rattle the cage a little bit, we decided to do some stuff to fight Zika. Zika is an emergent infection, super famous for the Rio Olympics. But there are no traditional books that say, oh, this is how we used to treat Zika. But there is a lot of information on how to treat dengue and West Nile virus, which are pathogens that are in the same family as of the virus as the Zika virus. So we used those traditional methods to fight Zika, and guess what? It worked.
And what are those methods?
So we use botanicals that have been traditionally used for dengue. Okay, so like for example, palo d'arco, papaya leaf, neem. So we basically went through traditional records of things that you used to treat dengue and this type of virus, and because this virus is so similar to dengue, it works. They are the same. They are in the same family. So what I'm trying to get is, okay, so those would be if you have a mosquito-driven infection such as dengue or Zika, that's one thing that you can do. Another thing you can do is you can be supplementing with adaptogens. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with adaptogens. And it turns out that different adaptogens work in different specific locations. We're doing a huge project right now with Echinacea and how Echinacea is able to upregulate or downregulate IL-8. IL-8 is a cytokine that causes like the cold symptoms, such as like the fever and the aches, and so when you upregulate that IL-8, you're upregulating your body's ability to fight infection.
And do you get more of those symptoms in that case?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is super interesting because those are evolutionary, ways that we fight infection. Like a fever helps you fight an infection. So maybe when you have a fever, supplementing with Tylenol and decreasing that fever is not a good idea.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because so many people think of a fever as something negative in and of itself and something that we need to take medications to get rid of. It's like, oh, you have a fever, this is bad, let's do something to lower the fever, not realizing that a fever is actually part of our body's way of making it harder for that microorganism to replicate.
Now, I'm going to tell you this, this is in the literature. It's a little bit controversial. I don't have kids. I don't have to make any decisions about vaccinations. I was fully vaccinated. Okay. So I'm going to start with that. But there is a study that says that giving kids Tylenol for their vaccination symptoms actually decrease the efficacy of the vaccine.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. And so now you get into this like conundrum of you have new infections coming back, and maybe the kids are not covered, and it's maybe because we were giving them Tylenol. And I think there was a little bit of a paragraph within that paper, and I'll send it to you so you can put it on your show notes.
Yeah, definitely.
With a little bit of correlation to autism. Now, do I believe that vaccines cause autism? No. Okay. I think the literature as far as of today is pretty clear about that correlation and causation. Do I think that giving kids a vaccination and then suppressing their fever and not activating the immune system is a bad idea? Completely. But, you know, I don't have any kids, so I don't have to go through that. Now you have kids. So, you know, and all of your listeners that are, you know, that are interested in having kids in the future, or, you know, you guys, you know, really need to keep an eye to the floor and try to an ear to the floor and really see where this is going, because it's getting more controversial and more controversial.
Yeah.
Okay, back to infections. Okay, so then you have other types of infections that are intracellular, and those are the hard ones to get rid of, because those intracellular infections have different ways of hiding from your immune system. For example, you know, we talked about how they might downregulate the VDR receptor. So now your vitamin D is not activating your immune system, and now you're not able to kill it. So when you start, and that's why it's so difficult to identify what the problem is, because when you run those genetic tests to look, the ELISA testing or Western blot testing to look for Lyme disease, I think right now the way you diagnose it is that you have to have 3 different chains that, you know, so 3 different markers. Okay. Naturopaths usually, you know, if there is like 1 chain, they might even treat empirically, you know, with a short course of antibiotics, just to make sure that that even if, you know, maybe the test failed, maybe and as a naturopath, I can do things for you to prevent the ill effects of an antibiotic. For example, you know, give some supplementation such as Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a probiotic that is yeast based. It's not bacterial based. So even if you're taking an antibiotic, it's not going to affect that because it's a different type of animal. You know, we can. I don't know if you're familiar with Cipro.
Yeah.
Okay, Cipro, awful antibiotic. It causes like tendon tears.
Whoa. I
don't know if you've ever heard of anyone like rupturing their Achilles tendon after a course of Cipro.
I haven't, no.
So yeah, so it's, you know, there's on Facebook right now, there's like a couple of like threads where people are like, do not ever let your doctor give you Cipro. So
yeah, you know, I did see that recently.
Yes, you know, so Cipro, it's a gyrase inhibitor. It prevents the DNA from, it helps the DNA de-entangle when it's replicating. And what the Cipro does, it blocks the gyrase, and then the DNA gets stuck and then it breaks. Okay. So that's how it works. So it doesn't really differentiate from like bacteria to human. And one of the things that Cipro does is that it uses magnesium as one of its cofactors. So when you start using Cipro, and I can send you those papers too, if you are magnesium deficient, you start chelating magnesium from different tissues, and that's how you end up attacking tendons, and then you start breaking tendons. And a contraindication for Cipro is an Achilles tendon tear, and it's so difficult to come back from an Achilles tendon tear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So things that you can do to mitigate that effect, if you are required to take Cipro, is make sure your magnesium status is healthy. The problem is that you cannot recommend a person take magnesium at the same time as Cipro, because Cipro makes this metal bond and it becomes ineffective. So the magnesium has to be in your system already in good status in order to prevent the tear. And taking magnesium at the same time as Cipro is going to basically waste your antibiotic. So there are different ways where we can be more careful and prevent the bad effects of taking an antibiotic.
Gotcha. Okay, so what else? What are more practical strategies people can use to help boost their immune function? Tell me more about botanicals.
Okay,
that's your area of that's your wheelhouse, man.
So I'm really careful with talking about botanicals, because I don't want, because one of the reasons I started following the Cipro, this Cipro lead, is because one of our botanicals acts like Cipro in the same mechanism of action as Cipro. So the last thing I want is for people to say, oh, I'm just going to start taking this every day, and now they have a tendon tear or worse,
Sure.
So that's why I'm like really careful. But like, for example, been geeking out a little bit on mushrooms lately, and those beta glucans, and how those beta glucans actually go into your intestine, and we have different receptors in our gut.
So just to specify, so in case any listeners are thinking that you're taking psilocybin mushrooms and getting high, you're talking about medicinal mushrooms, right?
Well, you know what? Psilocybin could be a medicinal mushroom, but
depends on the definition of medicine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But not nectorally for infection. So
not infection. No. So I'm talking about more like turkey tail and cordyceps and all of these different. Even your button, your regular mushroom has some beta glucans, that you can use. The problem with the industry is that it is, we get a little bit of research of beta glucans, and they can just make beta glucans. So they can just print them basically, and then and that's how you start getting all these different stories about like, oh, this supplement doesn't work because it's completely fake. So an easy way of ensuring that you're getting your beta glucans is just eat some mushrooms. You can go and order online some of these mushrooms, cordyceps, being one of them. And beta glucans is a type of sugar. And it's a very, sugars are really polar, so they can dissolve in water. So you can make yourself like a tea. So you can just make sure you put your mushrooms into hot water and you can drink that tea. And not only are you making sure that you're getting the right thing, because you know for sure that this is an organic type of mushroom, it's tasty, and you're getting it as a food source rather than as a concentrated, overpriced supplement. And then you can actually drink that stuff, and it's going to activate those receptors, those toll-like receptors in your gut and your body. These beta glucans are like foreigners to your body. So by the process of hormesis, your body ramps up its immune system to try to fight these beta glucans, and by proxy, it helps you clean out pathogens, and it helps you all these different things that we hear from mushrooms, like recovery. That's how that process works.
Cool. And by the way, thank you for mentioning hormesis, my favorite subject. So
yeah. So but that's the thing. Let's go back to Echinacea. Echinacea is acting by a similar process of hormesis, but it's a little bit more specific, because it only, in our experiments, they're in vitro and they're very preliminary. Okay, so I'm gonna say that in our experiments, you only get the spike on IL-8 if you have the infection. If you don't have the infection, that cell remains normal.
Okay. And just for people to remember, Echinacea spikes IL-8, which basically helps our body do its processes of fighting and getting rid of that pathogen.
Yeah, exactly. So in why is it doing this? That's what we're so excited, because sometimes scientists roll their eyes at the concept of a plant being able to upregulate or downregulate if you need something. But we are discovering that if that cell is not infected by the rhinovirus, that cell doesn't go and produce high levels of IL-8.
Yeah.
Which is just fantastic. So that is something that that maybe we can do as a litmus test, where if you have an intracellular organism and you take Echinacea and you don't get a fever, maybe you don't have anything.
Yeah.
But if you do, and this is, I'm just talking out, my head right now, not, but finding the different plants that do this type of stuff can be super, super beneficial. Another, are you familiar with Astragalus?
Yeah.
Astragalus is another type of adaptogen that it's immune modulating. What we found about Astragalus is that there is a bacteria in the rhizome, in the root, and that bacteria is a gram-negative bacteria. Okay, so there's two types of general bacteria: gram-negative, gram-positive. The gram-positive are easy to kill. The gram-negative have a larger cell, wall, gook, and it's more difficult for antibiotics to penetrate that. Well, when you take the Astragalus and you put it on the blender and you blend it, you actually are blending some of that bacteria too. And that LPS, it's called lipopolysaccharide, LPS, gets blended when you make that tincture. And when you take that tincture, and your body, a very similar process to hormesis, detects those fragments of the LPS, it upregulates your immune system.
Oh, wow.
And we did an experiment where we used this microbeads to remove all the LPS from the Astragalus. We made the tincture in the same steps, and it did not activate the immune system.
Wow. So you said this is a gram-negative bacteria that actually grows on the roots of the Astragalus plant?
Yes.
Wow. So it's almost like this is like natural vaccines, basically.
Yes. And it was so interesting because we actually did 3 levels of this. For Astragalus, we actually did 3 levels. We did an in vitro, okay? And then we did an immunoarray, to see what were the actual genes that were being activated. And then, because we're hippies and we love tinctures, we actually did 2 human studies with Astragalus where they drank 100 mils of Astragalus tincture. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with how we make tinctures, but it's basically Everclear and Astragalus. So it was a very happy experiment. But after that was done, then we drew blood and we actually looked at the white blood cells of these individuals. And if you take away the LPS, nothing gets activated. And if you have that LPS in there, that immune system goes rampant and just trying to clean and fix things. It was pretty cool.
Very cool. Now, I want to go back to Echinacea for a second because, I'd watched a video about you presenting on some of the research that you did with that. And you were talking about that you actually found different mechanisms of action depending on, different mechanisms of action opposing viruses depending on the part of the plant, of the Echinacea plant that you use. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Totally. So we in botanical medicine, there's a lot of memes, as for example, you'll have people say, oh, the fresh plant is better than the dried plant. Okay. And it turns out that that's not 100% true. But sometimes this traditional empirical evidence that has been passed for generations actually is true. And again, the concept of adaptogens doesn't really it's hard to prove because in a lab, people are used to that. The more you use something, the more of an effect it's going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. So when you tell someone, okay, this plant, if you use it, your body is going to figure out, do you need more of your immune system or do you need less? and it doesn't fit in scientists' heads.
Right.
That concept is like, no, you're full of shit. That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Well, so we separate the plant into three. We did the root, we did the plant, and then we did the flower. And we wanted to see what effect each one of these parts had on the same experiment. Turns out that, yes, the root upregulates your immune system, and then we didn't see the same effect on the flower. And we're like, what's going on? Because we saw resolution of infection with the flower.
Wow.
And that's where we were like, what's going on here? Why are we getting basically the same results? You're seeing less death of the cell, but one of them you see an increase of IL-8 and the other one you don't see an increase of anything. So once we started like looking at the different at all the different things that could be going on with this experiment, and we started, crossing our T's and dotting our I's, we found that the viral load on the ones that were treated with the flower was lower. So then we tested it, and sure enough, some parts of the plant are antiviral and other parts of the plant are immunomodulating. So that goes back to another thing that herbalists say. They say that eating the whole plant is better than eating a fraction of the plant, just the root or just the. And it's going to be very funny because my next step on this project is I'm going to try to find the best ratio of root to flower to plant.
Cool. Very cool.
And it's going to be very funny when the best ratio is the whole plant. When like nature already gave us, the answer.
Yeah. Very cool. So any final tips? I actually have to ask you on one thing. We were talking about vitamin D receptors earlier, and we talked about, sun exposure as being superior to vitamin D supplementation. Do you know if there's any way to actually affect the expression of the vitamin D receptor itself? That's a very good question, because I was just geeking out with my friend Billy, and he's another student. He's a year below me, and he was telling me that calcium deficiency actually might impact your vitamin D status. Interesting.
So it could be one of those things that maybe your calcium is not up to date, and maybe that's why your VDR is low. That doesn't mean go take calcium, for your, no, everything is in context. You have to figure out why. A very good way of increasing your VDR would be eliminating any underlying infections, if you're able to find that infection. But there are very safe things that you can do even if you don't have the diagnosis. For example, getting some sun exposure, to try to push that pathway a little bit better. Anything that is hormesis, that is not going to break the camel's back. Contrast showers.
Right.
Anything that is going to upregulate your immune system, such as fasting.
Yeah.
Those are things that we can do to prevent an infection, to make our infection treatments better. Or if you suspect an infection and you feel better after doing these things, that could be a way of getting rid of that infection. Quick story, my mother-in-law passed away from cancer. And when she was getting chemotherapy, she was just tired, and she was just really, really tired and not being able to walk or talk, or, she was just nauseous and tired. And then we went to visit one weekend, and we did, we had read somewhere that liver detoxification was so important for the symptoms of cancer. And my girlfriend actually did some Epsom salt baths that where she would do the Epsom salt and then help her out, and then they would go outside to the pool deck and they would suntan. And for the next 6 to 7 hours, it was like we had her back.
Wow.
And it was too late, and she probably never got that connection, but everyone else noticed. Maybe what was happening was like we were activating the detox pathways and the immune system back to normal, but it was just short-lived.
Right.
So maybe the constant activation of those pathways could help.
What happens if you get sun every day?
Yeah, exactly. And then you might never, you might get bitten by a tick and not get Borrelia.
Right. Yeah. And in that context, in an evolutionary context, it's not such a weird idea that you would get lots of sun every day.
Yeah.
Our ancestors didn't live indoors working at a computer in a cubicle most of the day. They were outdoors in the sun pretty much every day.
Have you read Stephen Guyena's book?
Yeah.
The last couple of chapters when he talks about sleep and stress.
Yeah.
Those are two things that downregulate your immune system.
Right.
Not sleeping enough and being stressed all the time, having that cortisol high.
Yeah. And
that's going to predispose you to some of these infections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so, I think to recap, some of the stuff you mentioned, lack of sleep and stress or things you just mentioned. And then you mentioned a number of hormetic mechanisms. So intermittent fasting, and I know there's research on that to show that it kind of almost rebuilds a lot of the immune cells. And then heat exposure, saunas, cold exposure or contrast showers, and then sun exposure, and then a lot of these botanicals that you mentioned, Astragalus and Echinacea and mushrooms.
And then in good nutrient status, but that's hard to tease out. One last thing that I want to mention is biofilms.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of people that have chronic sinus infections, and that might not present as fatigue, but man, they're annoying, to have a chronic infection, and another mechanism of that bacteria have is that if they start noticing they're being killed, they start chelating like different minerals, and they start creating this biofilm, and it's like a protector, and you might kill 90% of the bacteria with an antibiotic. But once they go into biofilm, that antibiotic is not penetrating that bacteria. So you might have like 10% of the bacteria that is not even touched.
And those are now the ones that are going to reproduce, and they're the ones that probably have the most antibiotic resistance.
And they're going to come back, and then you're going to take another course of antibiotics, and they're going to go into biofilm, and the cycle repeats. And that's how people end up with chronic infections, such as chronic UTIs, chronic sinus infections. You can have overgrowth of candida and all of these different things. And there are natural ways of reducing biofilm. N-acetylcysteine, tons of papers on N-acetylcysteine. My favorite though is xylitol.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, that's my favorite because it actually tastes good. There's a product, and can I say the name of the product? Do you mind? I don't.
Sure.
I don't get anything from this product.
The nasal spray.
Yeah. Xylitol.
Right.
It's actually pronounced.
I think it's Xyclear. Who knows how to pronounce it?
It's actually I was at a conference 2 years ago, and I met the inventor of the product.
Okay, well in that case, you know how to pronounce it better than I do.
It's pronounced clear.
It's pronounced just clear?
Yeah, but it's Xylitol, you know, whatever.
It's
But that's,
pronounced clear. Well, the guy needs to take some spelling classes.
yeah,
I like his product, but he needs to work on spelling a little bit.
it's an amazing product, and it's basically a xylitol spray
Hmm.
that you put into your nostrils, and then you are actually getting some xylitol into those bacteria, and then those bacteria that destroys the biofilm. And when you take your herbal or antibiotic, it's going to work better.
Yeah.
And there's different things that you can do for different from different bacteria. The reason we have xylitol in gum is to break the biofilm that could cause cavities.
Yeah. And I actually use it in with my toothpaste every evening when I brush my teeth.
Really?
For that reason as well.
Yeah, and there's different things that you can use for, you know, to break biofilm, like N-acetylcysteine for like things in your intestines, and you can pre-treat with N-acetylcysteine and then take a course of botanical or regular antibiotics, and that could help you finally clear that infection.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Guillermo. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I love hearing about all the research you're doing in this area. It's absolutely fascinating.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And where can people find more information about you? I know that you have a fairly new podcast. So tell us a little bit about that.
So you can reach my podcast. The podcast is 3030 Health on iTunes. You can go to 3030health.com, 3030health.com, and that's going to take you directly into the podcast. My website is 3030strong.com, 3030strong.com. I am going to be presenting at a botanical conference here at the school this week. Then I am scheduled to present at Paleo Effects, fantastic conference if you guys are into the paleo thing. And then I am also scheduled to present at the Ancestral Health Symposium in September. And I'm trying to bring more of this botanical stuff into these communities, because like it's funny that we sort of miss that, you know, that whole traditional aspect of medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the work you're doing to bring it to the forefront of our awareness. I'm a huge fan. You know, we've talked a lot about phytochemicals, botanicals. So it's a common interest of both of ours. I approach things more from kind of the hormesis and energy enhancement, mitochondrial enhancement angle, and you take more of the infectious disease angle. So it's just awesome to have these conversations with you. And thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom with my audience. Oh, and I should mention, in 12 weeks when you graduate and you are a doctor, people can actually come see you.
Actually, yeah. But, you know, I want to say something. It pisses me off that you're right. It's all hormesis. At the end of the day,
I know. Actually, I think when we talked about it before, you were kind of resistant to that.
It's all hormesis. Yeah. At the end, it's going to be all hormesis.
Yeah. You know, this is a little digression, but there's a really nice lecture from one of my favorite scientists. His name's Vince Giuliano. And he's like one of the leading thinkers in the aging sciences community. And he runs like the top blog on aging research. And he has a really nice 2-part presentation. It's free on YouTube. It's called The Science of Longevity. And, you know, his like fundamental thing that he says is pretty much the most research-backed set of mechanisms to actually extend longevity. You know, he basically pretty much everything he's talking about is all hormesis. Yeah. So I'm pretty convinced that it's like the crux of good health and prevention of disease and longevity. And now there's even this immune angle that I've been exposed to that I didn't even realize. You know, thanks to your work. So
yeah, and at the end, it's going to be, as long as you're not breaking that camel's back, you know, which is the problem with like the hormesis of CrossFit. Absolutely,
yeah. I think especially with people who are fatigued, you have to be real cautious with exercise. But you know, the mechanisms that you mentioned, you know, with the botanicals, intermittent fasting, cold exposure, heat exposure, I think those are all beautiful ways to start to get some hormesis going on without breaking the camel's back. Yeah. So thank you again, Guillermo. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey there. This is Ari Whitten with the Energy Blueprint. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And I assume you did. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have stuck around this long. So in that case, I want to make sure that you go over to theenergyblueprint.com and enter your name and email address so that you're on our email list and you get all the latest and greatest information as we release it. Theenergyblueprint.com is the #1 source for information on the science of overcoming fatigue and enhancing your energy levels. So make sure you head on over to theenergyblueprint.com, enter your name and email address, or just your email address, and sign up for our email newsletter where you'll get all the latest information, all the latest podcasts, all the latest articles and videos as we release them on the subject of increasing your energy levels. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.